Hello and welcome to this video on some of the most common beginner's mistakes and how to fix them. While some of the solutions are more pragmatic, others are simply a case of stopping what you are doing. No matter what these mistakes are, they will hinder your brewing. The first and perhaps most common is going to be a lack of cleaning and sanitizing. Some will consider these the same thing, and under certain circumstances, depending on what you're using to clean with, they can be. Otherwise, they should generally be considered as different and distinct. Cleaning removes dirt and other solid contaminants. Sanitizing kills bacteria and other pathogens. One without the other is pointless. Cleaning will remove solid mess but leave pathogens. They will make off flavors and possibly cause food poisoning or worse. Sanitizing without cleaning will create mess and reduce the efficacy of sanitizing by hiding pathogens and contaminating bacteria or fungi. In some cases, it can even cause your yeast to be outcompeted. The solution is simple. Doing what is at hand, clean and sanitize properly. Take the extra time and use the right tools for the job. Next is using old and probably long past good yeast. Things like packets of yeast that came under the lid of a ready-mixed beer brewing kit, or that have been in the back of a cupboard for far too long. No matter what, the yeast is likely to be dead or debilitated. Even liquid yeast culture is going to be in the same place. They will metabolize all the substrate in the culture and begin to die. The only two options to solve this are to buy fresh yeast, or culture your own and keep it well supplied with nutrients and substrate. Further to using old yeast is underpitching the yeast. This is adding too little. Underpitching is more commonly a problem with those trying to stretch their yeast too far. The most obvious sign of pitching too little yeast is a lot of residual sugar. In beer, that is typified by it being very sweet, but more accurately measured with a hydrometer. The simplest solution for this is to pitch all of a given yeast packet, whether it is liquid or dry yeast. Option 2 is to culture your yeast until it is turbid, and then ensure that there is adequate yeast available, which will require some experience on your part in judging just how much is present. While still on yeast, there is a common problem with pitching the yeast into too hot or too cold a fermentation. The problem with both is reasonably self-evident. Too hot and you injure, if not kill, the yeast. Too cold and the yeast will sink to the bottom and not ferment. The two simplest solutions are to accurately measure the temperature of your fermentation. Second, choose the right yeast for what you're doing. While lager yeast will ferment from the bottom, they need a cold environment. Conversely, ale yeast generally ferment on top and need a warmer environment. Making sure you choose the right yeast for the right application is important there. This problem carries through to brewing and fermenting as a whole. Notably, if your fermentation gets too hot or too cold, it will go wrong. We've mentioned temperature for yeast itself, but this is also related to the style of fermentation. Trying to brew a lager in the high summer or ale in the middle of winter will not go well. This applies to ethanol, wine, and cider. You need to either pick your time or conduct your fermentations in a controlled environment. Somewhere you can ensure it is either going to be warm enough or cold enough for the purposes. Fermenting in too hot a temperature for any given yeast can lead to the production of either off flavors or, in some extreme cases, toxic byproducts like methanol. We've mentioned the use of yeast in the right way, but it's the right style as well, or more accurately, using the wrong style in the wrong conditions with the wrong yeast. This brings together the last 3 points. Individually, each one is often done wrong. Collectively, not so often. But some people think yeast is yeast and can be substituted freely. If you try to brew an ale, make sure to use an ale yeast, and the same applies to lager, cider, wine, and ethanol. The needs and products of each are generally quite niche. For example, you may be able to get a reasonably high amount of ethanol out of a lager yeast in lieu of an ethanol-specific yeast strain, but that does not mean it's going to be anywhere near the same concentration. and you could never possibly hope to achieve the same with an ale yeast under relatively normal circumstances. This also plays into many of the flavors. You'll get a lot of off flavors from your yeast if you use them for the wrong style. The solution for this is again quite straightforward. Use the right yeast for the right application. Finally, there's the use of the wrong type of vessel. This applies to both primary fermentation and bottling. In the case of fermenting, there are issues with volume, vessel opacity, and shape. Too small or too large a vessel for the amount of fermentable substrate and yeast pitched will influence how well it can convert the sugars. Bigger vessels will dilute both the sugar substrate and the alcohol. In the case of the former, this makes it harder for yeast to metabolize it. In the case of the latter, it can be somewhat better, as you'll be able to get more ethanol out of it as the ethanol concentration is lower. This means the yeast will survive for more time, fermenting more. The downside to that is that it will require more energy to distill, so you have a trade-off in that respect. You also have to look at the concentration of what you're trying to make in the end. Diluting beer down until it tastes like Budweiser isn't a great idea. The opacity of your vessels is another consideration. Opaque vessels are best to use. They are less prone to influences from sunlight. This can cause off flavors or chemical reactions. Clear vessels tend to react via light, and this can cause off tastes and other undesired effects, particularly with the yeast. This can be solved by storing it in a dark cupboard or using opaque vessels. Then there is vessel shape. While a gallon bucket works, you may want to use something more substantial. Preferably a fermentation vessel with a spigot on the front, a reliable airlock that will keep air on one side and not the other, and an airlock. Then you have something like a narrow bottom vessel. These can be useful for separating out yeast, but can also cause an early termination of your fermentation. This will be a very subjective choice on your part and needs. Finally, there are bottles, and here is where you will find the big problem. It's pressure rating when you carbonate. People continue to try to use something like an empty Coke bottle. While these are pressure rated, it may not be to the level of carbonation, and this can be reduced over time, which makes it a ticking time bomb. The plastic that these are made from can be affected by things like, say, sunlight, and if you're not storing them properly, or if they wear out over time, they will not hold up to the proper pressure that is generated by carbonating of your beer, cider, or anything else. This will lead to them exploding quite violently and creating an extreme mess. The simple solution to this is the use of proper, generally glass, pressurized and pressure-rated bottles when carbonating. To avoid the mess, we also suggest storing them in a large tub, or at least having something on hand to clean up. As you can see, there are a range of avoidable mistakes when you first start to brew. These are almost entirely universal. It does not matter if you brew beer, cider, wine, or moonshine. Each of these is important and relevant. You'll find that using the appropriate equipment, using it in the right way, and having the right ingredients in the right situation will make your brewing much better, and following them carefully and mitigating the effects in the mistakes seen here will greatly reduce the number of stalled fermentations, fermentations that don't taste right, or fermentations you have to throw away because they've gone bad before you could ever get near drinking them. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.